everyone, and welcome back to our weekly lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Today we continue looking at the section on misdeeds. We'll be covering several lines today, and the very first one is what it states here, to take what others cherish. Now this taking, of course, is taking unreasonably and by force. So it would also be invading, encroaching upon, appropriating, embezzling. And what others cherish is really what they value, what they hold dear. Well, what might that be? In order to understand this, we can reflect on what it is that we value. There are, of course, the tangibles, like our home, our car, our mobile, laptop, etc. But then there are also intangibles, like our reputation, our career, our successes. And all of these can be encroached upon or taken or ruined by others. And that's the misdeed here. I guess when we think about taking what others cherish, and when we reflect back on, what happens if someone was to take away something we hold dear? How would we full from initially, let's say, for example, losing your mobile and the inconvenience of that, all the mobile contacts, social media contacts that we have on that phone. So there's the inconvenience, but also there's the distress of, possible identity fraud, because nowadays on our mobiles we have, mobile banking apps, etc. And even, photos, videos that we've taken that might be things that we don't want to share with others. There are private moments. So you can see that it's not just about simply a loss of money or property, but actually it's much, much more. What we hold, what we cherish, is often sort of has memories attached as well. So if we are able to turn our minds to how distressed we might feel, how it might cause harm to also our loved ones, then we might begin to understand what it might feel to someone who has their possessions and property taken as well. So ultimately, this line is about developing a sense of empathy, to think from the other person's perspective. Now, in this particular lecture, Venerable Master Kong explained that most people want goodness in their lives. They want to do good things, and they want to develop themselves to lead meaningful lives. But sometimes they don't know how to, or for many people, they do know what they should be doing, but they lack the motivation to do so. And that's really the pivotal factor, isn't it? How do we get ourselves to change? How do we motivate ourselves to take that extra step and do what we should be doing? And that's why this learning is so important. It's a learning that could be classed as sort of moral learning, character development, but these days people might even call it positive psychology, the idea of living your life to its fullest potential, and ensuring that inner potential is realized. And not so long ago, this kind of learning took place within families. They were sort of modeled through parents, through elders, for their children. It also took place in formal education when you went to schools. Teachers, the textbooks that you read would also have this kind of content, helping you understand, the correct or incorrect, right and wrong ways of living, healthy and unhealthy ways of living. But also within society, there were certain sort of expectations, and that would also help you provide the right context for you to live life according to those healthy habits. So and we're not just talking about pre-modern China. We're not just talking about China. Of course, right now we're talking about the Taoist tradition in China, but also there would be the Confucian, beyond China. Societies in the past would also ensure that the young, the children, would have this kind of learning. And that's because many societies in the past were underpinned by different faith traditions. So many other faith traditions will also talk about this idea of moral learning. If we look to, say, for example, the Confucian tradition, so we know that Confucius and Mencius were key founders of and figureheads of this tradition. And Mencius makes the point here, if you read the very first sentence, that actually humans and animals, like birds and beasts, what's the difference between them? I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, the difference between humans and animals generally. Well, actually, Mencius says that it's only a very slight difference, because like animals, we have a physical body, we have a beating heart, we have consciousness, we can feel pain. So there are many things that are alike, and many people who have done genetic studies will say that, for example, us and chimpanzees may be quite similar from a genetic level. So even in the times of Mencius, he said that the difference is only a very minor difference. But this minor difference is really the most important. What is it? He says here that this is what makes a noble person or an ordinary person. Okay? And Shun, who many of you will know, King Shun of the late and high antiquity and sort of Chinese times, Chinese history, considered a sage, a leader, a very virtuous role model. He says he was very clear about what it was in him that was this slight difference. And it talks about how humanity and rightness were the source of his actions, rather than just performing acts of humanity and rightness, or humaneness and rightness. So it sort of boils down to these two virtues, which we come across again and again in Confucian texts, but also Taoist texts, Buddhist texts, this idea of humanity. And what is it? Well, as the English suggests, and same as the Chinese, humanity is the essential part of being human. So humanity, human. And the thing about this essential part, if you strip this, if you think about the human being, what is the core element? Very good way of thinking about this is to think about when we say someone is inhumane. What does that mean? It often means that they're cruel, they're unfeeling. They don't think about how other people, they don't consider the feelings of others. And therefore, this humanity is none other than being able to feel like the other person, to be able to empathize, to think and feel in the other person's shoes. So that is the core of humanity. And yes, humans have this, and you might say that, other beings may also have this quality, but the key point is that humans can learn this. So we're not necessarily born, as the compassionate beings, and in life, we have to struggle with our personal interests, etc. But we can learn to develop this so that we constantly, like Shun, are able to use this virtue. And that's different from animals. So animals like dogs can be trained, for example, guide dogs, to help people. But this inner training, this training of morals and virtues, humanity and rightness, is something that is less accessible. Not to say it's impossible, but less accessible for birds and bees. And so that's the key point that Mencius is talking about. This slight difference is as virtues, but the more important thing is that we can bring it out, we can develop it, and we can fully embody it in whatever we do, just like Shun here. Interesting here how he says that humanity and rightness were the source of his actions, as opposed to just performing acts of humaneness and rightness. What does that mean? Well, it means that he did things with the intention out of humanity and rightness. Emperor Shun did not do things just because these were acts of humanity and rightness, and he had no intention of doing it, but he just wanted to look good. So there's a difference. One is, just in the act itself. The other one is from the mind, and that really addresses the source of the problem for many of us, and in particular with this whole section of misdeeds, is to think about the source of all of these misdeeds is in our minds and in our thoughts. The idea of humanity, thinking about the other person, considering their views and feelings, is really, if we were able to do that, then we don't need to think about avoiding A, B, C, D misdeeds that are all listed in the Exalted Treatise. We simply need to turn our minds to humanity and rightness, and this will actually ensure that none of those misdeeds are committed. Many of you might be reading this thinking, well, what's the difference between humanity and rightness? And this is something that was innovative from Mencian philosophy. So humanity, as we've already talked about, is that idea of thinking about others over and above oneself, and that idea of compassion. But understanding how others feel does not necessarily mean that one takes action. Okay, so the rightness here emphasizes the idea of taking action and doing what is right in that specific circumstance. So just a very simple example, you see a child who's acting out, who's throwing a temper tantrum. Now clearly being compassionate would mean to sort of encourage them to stop, and to take control of themselves. But that if you do that, that might even upset them more. But that is the right thing to do in that point in time. So even though it might upset them more if you just tell them to get their act together and let's go, pick up your things, etc. But because it's the right thing to do, then that's that virtue of rightness. This is a very simple example, and there are many more. But humanity is emphasizing that we have to empathize, we have to be compassionate, think of others, and rightness is emphasizing, making sure that the right things occur at the right time in a timely fashion. So doing what is right. Now, essentially, if we come back to that idea of taking what others cherish, which is the misdeed, the flip side of that is really where we have to focus on, which is to develop empathy over the plight of others. And I think the dandelion is a very fitting picture here, because it sort of makes you think about what you want or what you wish for. And if you think about what you wish for, what you cherish, and you sort of extend that, if you think about, okay, well, those are the things that other people would want as well, and you develop that empathy, then you will naturally not take what others cherish. So rather than focus on the misdeed, I think there are very many in this section. I think what we need to do is to think about the flip side, think about what it is that we have to focus our mind on. And this is what I've called the action here. Okay, so that's the very first misdeed, and then how we can turn it around and think about things from a positive light. The next sentence is the next misdeed is to assist someone in wrongdoing. So assisting is obviously helping someone, and this wrongdoing could be any wrongdoing, including what we just mentioned above, taking something that others might cherish. So you haven't initiated that misdeed, but you're helping others. And so the main wrongdoing here, the main misdeed, is not the wrongdoing itself, but the fact that you are assisting them. You're facilitating this misdeed in some way. Now, when we see someone do wrong, we see someone commit a misdeed or about to commit a misdeed, well, there are two sort of pathways that we can take, isn't it? The first is to dissuade them from wrongdoing. And oftentimes, that's only possible if we are in a position of trust. We've had you have a long-term relationship with this person, in which we mutually trust each other. We're confident in each other's opinions, and they're willing to listen to you, and your good advice to tell them to change what they're doing. And so you could do this through just giving them advice, or through your personal example. But the first option then is to just try to intervene in some way. You've recognized that what they're doing is wrong. You want to do something about it, and you sort of have to think about the best way to do so, to intervene. So that's one of the options. The second option then is being complicit with them. And there's many ways. That is, firstly, you're just going along with what they're doing. And you may or you may not want to go along with it, but you just do it anyway. In your mind, you might feel uncomfortable, or you might feel happy. You just don't need to resist. The second one is really actively assisting them. And the third is ignoring what's happening. Could be something that's blatantly unfair, but you remain silent and you provide no resistance. So all of those above would be part of this idea of being complicit, which would be part of this idea of assisting someone in doing wrongdoing, assisting someone in their wrongdoing, because anything that is not A is B. So if you're not dissuading them, you're not actively thinking of ways to intervene, then you are assisting them. It's that simple. Even though you think that this line talks about actively assisting. Well, if you're not actively assisting, but you put up no resistance, then it amounts to the same thing, because that wrongdoing continues to be carried out. Whatever that is being unfair is still going on. And so very intuitively, you'll realize that the two pathways lead to two different consequences. First, if you try to dissuade them, then this will lead to accumulating merit. That's a merit in itself. The second pathway, being complicit with them, assisting them, would be racking up demerits, and therefore ultimately misfortune in your own future. And there's really no middle way, is there? It's either merit or demerit. And on top of that, it's not that simple. It's not as clear-cut as that. Because if you think about it, the merit or demerit is not a single point, or one demerit point or one merit point for helping them out or dissuading them. It's the extent of that merit or demerit depends on how many people would be influenced or impacted by their actions, by this misdeed. In other words, how many people would be harmed? So let's say if you look on the left here, everyone in this community, in this train station would be affected, then that's the amount of demerits would be much more worse than, let's say, on the right hand, where it's just a child taking someone else's toy and you haven't stopped them. So can you see how that merit or demerit, the extent of that, changes depending on the consequences of that misdeed? It's not as clear-cut as one demerit point or one merit point. But it's not just the impact on the here and now. We also have to think about the consequences down the track. So if we look at that photo on the right, this little toy, the child's taken someone else's toy, basically stolen another child's toy. You think it's something small. But actually, if as an adult we don't stop that child, we don't tell them that it's wrong, then they might think that they can get away with it and develop this bad habit of taking other people's things, and not being told otherwise. And first few times they might feel that bit guilty, but over time they think that they're just taking advantage of others and they're getting free things. And then over time, this becomes an ingrained habit, and they take things that are more valuable, more expensive, and the consequences become much more serious. So therefore, that merit or demerit is not just in the here and now, but also what happens down the future, in the future, based on what you haven't done at this point in time. By being complicit in this wrongdoing, how what's the consequences of that? And on top of that, whatever this person does, the consequences, that becomes your own demerit or merit. So if you're able to, help them think things through and change, then the merit of that might be quite immense if that person was going to harm this whole train station, for example. So in fact, there's nothing that's too small that shouldn't be considered. And it reminds me of this really wonderful quote by Liu Bei, who was the founding emperor of the Shu Han kingdom, at a time when China was sort of divided into three kingdoms, three sort of main areas. And Liu Bei, in his final moments, instructed his son this important advice, which is, do not commit a misdeed because you think it's minor, and do not fail to perform a good deed because you think it's too small. So nothing's ever too small, whether it's a good deed or bad, bad deed, because actually the repercussions could be quite immense later down the track. And for us, we're only thinking about the here and now. More importantly, this develops bad habits. So if it's a small misdeed, you think you can get away with it, and it becomes a bad habit down the track. So there's nothing that's trivial. If you see a misdeed or a good deed, and you can be able to intervene, then try to do so. And the merits or the demerits are yours. Now, most of the time, get back to this, this idea of someone's wrongdoing, this kind of behavior. The reality is that these behaviors don't exist in random. They don't occur randomly. Oftentimes, it occurs out of a particular social context. And the people around this person, by being complicit, by ignoring, by letting it happen, maintain and actually sustain this culture. So at a very simple level, very simple example is within the family. A child growing up, if they develop some unhealthy habits, then that's often related to the family members, what they see of their family members, particularly their carer or their parent who looks after them the most, they have the most contact with. Whether or not that parent or carer is intentionally trying to teach them this habit, the child will pick it up anyway, and they're often a reflection of their parents. So there's that context where, if there is an unhealthy behavior, then that is sustained because the people around them are not calling them out for it. They're not telling the child that they should change, that this is wrong, and correcting that mistake. So it becomes perpetuated. But for many of us who are at work or studying, we'll be part of organizations, and that organization itself has a culture. Most of the time, it's the leader, the boss, that sets that culture. Whatever the boss says goes. And that kind of a culture is fine if the leader is very reasonable, is considerate of everyone in the organization. But what if they're not? What if there are some unfair conduct or misconduct? Then there's an onus on everyone in the organization to help to prevent that from becoming the culture, by which a culture of a very toxic culture or of unfair practices is sustained. So it's part and parcel of being a professional. And in this particular text by Johnson and Ridley about the ethics of being a professional, I've just taken this paragraph out because it seems to really sort of echo the comments that we've just made, which is that, if you realize that there's something that's ethically wrong, it is just as ethically wrong, okay, to be complicit, to say nothing, with unfair practices in your workplace, as it is to engage in it yourself. So if you do nothing, what they're saying here is it's the same as if you were to actively engage in that conduct, which is what we've just mentioned. It says your silence coupled with your inaction makes you culpable, and you are essentially an accomplice to this crime. As a professional, you cannot easily excuse yourself from the responsibility of combating unfairness and inequity, and not doing anything bears the same consequences as doing something that's overt. So not doing anything might be the safe option because it might protect your job, but ultimately it has the same consequences because you are sustaining that culture, and ultimately that might lead to the downfall of your organization if someone actually blows a whistle and the whole company has to restructure and go about quite a heavy kind of restructuring and contemplation of these ideas and practices. So the consequences are the same, and more importantly, the demerits are the same for yourself. And so what this particular text, the Ethics of Professionals, but also the Exalted Treatise, is encouraging us to do is to call out and try to change unfair practices that we see around us, to try to prevent the wrongdoing that we see around us, rather than assisting and abetting, other than sort of just being silent. The question then is, for most people, is how? Okay, so yes, we, for many people, they might want to create change, to bring about change that things are not so unfair or difficult or toxic. But how does one do that? Now, most people might jump to sort of thinking about extreme behaviors like whistleblowing, protesting, petitioning, etc. But actually, the reality is that we try to do what we can within our abilities, within our means. And at the end of the day, it boils down to this virtue, which mentioned a lot in Confucianism, the idea of being loyal. So if we try to call out and create change in our organization, that is to be loyal. It's not to bite the hand that feeds you. It's actually trying to think of the best for this organization and not just the best for our job. It reminds me of a very interesting part in the Xunzi, which is a book that's attributed to the 3rd century BCE philosopher Xun Kuang. And Xunzi is actually one of the, you'd say, early Confucians during the time of Mencius as well. And in a particular chapter in this book, it's about how to be a good minister, how to be a good employee. He mentions that there are 3 kinds of loyalty: the greatest kind of loyalty, the next best, second best, the lowest kind, and that's not the worst. The worst are people who are villains towards the state. So, in other words, there's the people who are the best ministers, next best, worst, and then there are people who are, seemingly ministers because they have that position, they have that title, but actually they're criminals. They're using their position, and they are ultimately ruining the state. Okay, so let's take a look at the different kinds of loyalty. The first one, the greatest kind, is to be able to use one's virtue to really, it says envelope, but really to really shield and help your leader and therefore transform them. So a very good example of this is, if you, through your own actions and over time in your particular job, you're able to develop a very good relationship with your boss, your leader. Everything that you do is to the highest of standards of excellence. You are trusted because of your diligence, your good work ethic, and they know that you are thinking for the best interests of the organization. And therefore, because of this virtue that you've developed over a long period of time, then you help them make the right decisions, and good strategies are implemented. Strategies that are not going to be unfair, strategies that will allow for everyone to be involved in collaboration, etc. So this is using your virtue, developing yourself such that you do the best in your job, you're recognized, and therefore you are an inspiration to others, including your own leader, your boss. And that's sure to help them think through wrongdoings and sort of potentially harmful policies. The second one, the second next best kind of loyalty as an employee is to use your virtue, again, developing yourself, cultivating yourself, to help temper your leader and patch up their faults. So this leader, they may have their own faults, poor judgment at times, but because of your virtue, you're able to point it out and really sort of come to an agreement, in which case they also feel that your ideas, your opinions are very worthy. You've perhaps got a different strategy, and they're able to take that on board. And that's because you understand that and you're accommodating to their weaknesses. Okay, so not everyone is perfect. And perhaps sometimes when people make decisions, they might not be fully informed. And therefore, it's our role as a subordinate, as an employee, to help them understand, to make sure that they are fully informed. And this is through our, developing that trust, the leader's confidence in our abilities, our opinions, our advice, that, they appreciate that. So that's sort of the next best. Perhaps you're not the most inspirational person, but you're able to still provide timely suggestions, and also to sort of come to an agreement and cooperate with these better strategies and policies. The third lowest kind of loyalty is when you remonstrate against them. And, they've already implemented something, or they're about to implement something that would be, would harm, or, be unfair to certain employees, certain people in the organization, and you sort of point that out. To remonstrate is to provide honest and frank advice, and to confront them with it, to the point where perhaps they get annoyed. So that's probably not the best thing to do, because when someone is annoyed, they're less likely to accept your advice and your good counsel. But that's why it's the lowest kind of loyalty. You don't want to wait until that happens. You do your best to try to prevent that policy from even being sort of put on the table, from even being implemented or written up. You sort of try to prevent that from happening. So that's why this is the lowest kind of loyalty. But it's actually not the worst. The worst is here, where it says to care nothing for whether one's leader is honored or disgraced. So you actually don't care about them at all. You don't care about your leader. You don't care about, what happens to the organization. In this case, we're talking about the state. During the times of Xunzi, the Chinese Empire, or China was divided up into various feudal states. So each feudal state was led by a feudal lord. So this is why it's talking about states. But really, the modern day equivalent would be either a nation state or an organization. And says you don't really care about what happens to this leader, nor do you care about the consequences for the people in the state, whether the state is going to be invaded by someone else or not. And all you think about is actually just cooperating and accommodating them to maintain your own salary, your own position, and to ensure that your own family is taken care of. Because if you put up some resistance, if you try to be honest and give honest advice and try to correct their mistakes, then you might lose your job. You might be dismissed or demoted. So that's why it says here, you lazily cooperate and improperly accommodate. So accommodation and cooperation, these are actually quite positive. We would associate cooperation and collaboration with something that you would want to do in your work environment. But why is it that it seems to be negative here? Well, because cooperation here is lazy, because that's the easy way out, to just do as the boss says and not tell them that actually there are going to be consequences, the company will suffer, a loss of reputation, it's clearly corrupt, etc., etc. So that's a lazy way out, the easy option. The most convenient thing to do is just to turn a blind eye and ignore what's happening around you. And improperly accommodating means that you accommodate even when you know that it's wrong. And you may do so in a flattering way. You might say, oh, actually, this is a very good idea, when actually it's not. And as it says here, that's because you're only thinking about yourself. But look how Xunzi actually concludes this particular section. He says that this is not the lowest form of loyalty. We might think that actually most employees are like this. They're just thinking about a job from 9 to 5, and ensuring that they have a salary for their own livelihoods. Actually, Shinzit says that this is to be a villain towards the state. In other words, this is something that is an offense. You're a criminal because you're not doing your job at all. And this is not just in your position as a minister. You're not being responsible to your leader to point out that he's not fully informed when he makes this decision. So you're not accountable to your leader, but also you're not accountable to others in the organization, and ultimately the community, the state at large. For organizations today, when we think about a company, they obviously have a client base from the community. And so ultimately it's about serving members of the community. So if we are not responsible in what was mentioned before, the different levels of loyalty, how to really be diligent in your job, then actually it's being complicit in wrongdoing, which is, as earlier mentioned, the text on ethics for professionals, it's to be an accomplice in the crime. So that's why here, even in Shunzi, it also says this is to be a villain towards the state. You're not innocent, you're actually involved. And that's the really scary part, is when you do nothing, it seems as if you're innocent, but actually you create that and you sustain and preserve that culture in which, people are harmed. And all of that is added to your account, to the demerits. But if you, in some way, through your example, if you are the head of your own department in that organization, and you're able to, ensure that they're productive, they don't, have these, this misconduct, and you're able, other people in the organization see that it works, then they might be inspired. So it's not to sort of say that you engage in sort of extreme behavior like protesting. It's about trying to do everything that you can within your means to help create that change. And ultimately, I think, rather than talking about, whether or not you agree or disagree, or you help or hinder wrongdoing, it's ultimately about promoting goodness. And this is something that we've mentioned earlier. This particular phrase comes from the Buddhist tradition. The phrase is literally to rejoice in another person's merits, which is actually to assist in good deeds. And that may be simply praising them, helping them realize that this is something that is very important, that this is a very good deed, celebrating it and promoting it. And in the collected commentaries, it provides a very good analogy, which is related to this photo. And it's this idea of incense. So in the past, we buy incense at the marketplace, and the analogy that's used is that obviously with incense there's this really this fragrance, and so the person who's selling the incense will have this fragrance, but the person who's buying the incense, who's holding it in their hands, will also have the fragrance. And then and anyone who sort of is a bystander, sort of standing close to these people, will also have this fragrance, because the fragrance sort of envelops them. Now, the bystander sort of enjoying and the fragrance doesn't reduce or lessen the fragrance of the person who's buying and selling the incense, does it? So this is actually an analogy for rejoicing in another person's merits. So if another person, let's say A, has helped B, and C is really praising them, well, that doesn't detract from or lessen the merits of A. who has actually performed the good deeds. By praising them, by promoting that good deed, you're actually multiplying it. And it's also multiplied in your own account. Praising others is a good deed in itself, is a merit in itself, which will lead to good fortune. But on top of that, it means that more people get to understand this good deed and also emulate it. So there are also flow-on effects. So for this particular wrongdoing, this misdeed, to assist someone in wrongdoing, I think the focus is not to avoid that, to think about, okay, well, other people around me, how do I respond to their wrongdoing? I think how we can focus is to focus on praising and promoting their good deeds. So the same person could be doing good or bad, but if we promote and praise their goodness, then that's what they will focus on, and that's where they will develop. And I think that's something that becomes very positive. So we don't need to look out for other people's misdeeds and start judging others all too readily. But we look out for their goodnesses and we try to help them along that path. So that's sort of how we can sort of turn this misdeed around. The next few lines are very interesting. Also two different, but also quite similar misdeeds. It is to flaunt influence by having one's way and to seek success by humiliating others. So flaunting is really sort of giving free rein to, doing whatever you want because you have this authority or power and you abuse that power. And I think it's very similar to the second line afterwards, which is about humiliating others. Clearly, you also have to be in a position of some authority in which people would have confidence in you, such that you are able to then speak out and humiliate others. And in doing so, both these lines are about achieving success for yourself. So ensuring that your self-interests are met over and above those of others. And ultimately, both of these misdeeds come about because of a lack of virtue and a lack of reason. So you are unable to justify yourself, and therefore you use and abuse your power. You use sort of very manipulative means like humiliating others in order to get what you want. And for both of these lines, I think we can think about, in order to avoid doing this, think about what happens if you were to one day lose that power. So there's a very common saying in English to be nice to people on your way up because you'll meet them again on your way down. One day when the tables are turned, then you will be the one in the firing line because you've abused your power, you've harmed certain people, humiliated them. And when you have lost your authority and they are relatively more powerful, then they will be there wanting to seek revenge. So just by thinking about what happens if you were in their situation, if you were the less powerful person, again, it's sort of turning your mind to the other person's perspective and walking in their shoes, then it helps you sort of realize that actually this is a misdeed. It's not just because I have the position that everyone should listen to me, but actually how I use that power and privilege to inspire respect and to help others develop. And it sort of reminds me of this line in the Deeds of Gwei, which it tells us that if we are in a position where there are people who are our employees who serve us, then we have to act in ways that inspire their respect. We have to earn that respect. And yes, it's important to ensure that we have proper conduct, that we ourselves, whatever we wear, whatever we say and do, we are dignified. But also in interacting with them, we have to remember to be kind and forgiving, to be generous. It may mean that we have to provide more detailed instructions. They may not know what we want. Simply if we say, give them a very simple instruction, we need to sort of spell it out. And if we can do that 1 or 2 times, then that person will be more aware and they don't need us to tell them in such detail the 3rd or 4th time. So it's having that patience. And if they do something wrong, to then reflect on ourselves and say, well, why? Was it something that I said that could have been communicated better? Was it something that I did that sort of made them think that, that this kind of behavior was okay? So to evaluate ourselves and to earn that respect. And as it says here in the second part, if we force others, we use our power to say, okay, well, this is what I want, and I want this because I'm your boss, then they may not understand why we need it so urgently. And therefore, they may not do it with such urgency. So we have to convince them. We have to allow them and educate them to appreciate the importance of this task, the urgency of this task. And perhaps with this reasoning, with this justification, they will accommodate and agree to conducting that task in the right way. And so you can see that, even in a primer like the Deeds of Way written in the past for young children, these ideas and habits were to be taught at a young level. In many, in some households, people might have had servants, might have had maids. So it's important to know how to interact with people that are our employees at all ages. To never look down on others, but to help develop them, their capacities, their thinking, their understanding of how everything is happening in this organization, in this household, and that they are a key part of the household, that they are a key part of the organization, so that everything that everyone does contributes in some way, and everyone just needs to step up to the plate to be able to put in their efforts, and ultimately everyone benefits. So it's about helping people understand this over and above just using your position and your power to make them do what you want. The next line is quite short, and it's the idea of destroying someone's crops. So this was in a time, we know that the Exalted Treatise was written around the sort of 13th century, and it was sort of a very agricultural society. And in a way, a large part of the population were farmers. They were the sort of bread and butter of the economy. And so the idea of destroying crops is not something that is at an individual level, just simply sort of damaging someone else's agricultural produce, but it's actually about, from a higher level, as a government leader, as an official, to not allow people to go about their work, so their agricultural work. And this, of course, means that they lose their ability to produce their livelihood, their own food, their subsistence, etc. So this idea of destroying one's crops is not just is something on a small scale, but also at a larger level, larger scale as well. And there's a story in the collected commentaries. It's quite a dramatic story, but I think it's also perhaps sends a message that actually this is not just something that's a small misdeed, you would say a minor misdeed, as we talked about before, but it has consequences. There's a story about a young boy, his name's Li Jia, and he would sort of raise cattle for his work, as his profession. But what he did was that he would sort of let the cattle sort of loose on other people's farmlands. And you can imagine that these farmers that have hectares of land, acres of land, so, if sort of on the outskirts of their property, it was not so well supervised. They were not, policing all of their borders of their property. So what he did was that he sort of let out the cattle loose on maybe the outskirts of other people's properties that no one knew, and the cattle would just sort of destroy the crops, eat as they wished. And one day what happened, they obviously did this for over a period of time, but what happened one day was that he was actually struck by lightning, and fatally struck by lightning. And very interestingly or strangely was that when he was found, and why people knew about this, sort of the consequences of his actions, was because on his back it was written that his offence was letting cattle loose and destroying crops. So the idea that this was, he had done this over some time, he had destroyed the crops of several farmers, crops that could have been used to save people who were in poverty, who were in hunger, and he didn't control his cattle, and really basically not only destroyed but took other people's property, their agricultural crops. So this is, you might think that this is not necessarily affecting our lives. Most people are living in cities, but at the same time, it's sort of, we can extrapolate the idea, which is getting in the way of someone else's work, and their work outcomes, what it is that they need to produce. And I think that sort of goes back to that idea of, even if you think that it's something that's very trivial, is something that others would overlook, something that people might not know about, then you still have to avoid misdeed. Okay. So the that is emphasized in this particular line is that crops, but they're sprouts as well, sprouting crops. And the sprouts are when it's most vulnerable, that they cannot even grow to be crops, that at that time they have the potential to grow, but you're ruining that potential. So that's also part of the leads to the gravity of that misdeed, is that destroying not only the crops, they've already sort of matured, but also seedlings and sprouts that haven't had the ability to mature. So it's a very vulnerable time for this produce. Given the time, we'll have to stop here today. And you can see that with the last few talks, we've been going through several sentences. I think based on our earlier lectures, where we've sort of tried to spend 1 hour just on one sentence, it's provided the main principles are very well explained. So now it's a matter of sort of going through the different types of misdeeds and thinking about it in different ways and how it is we can avoid them, overcome them, or think about them from a positive perspective. So that's what we'll continue to explore next week. Thank you very much for listening.